I want you to picture something for me. A Saturday morning. Late autumn. The kind of morning where the light comes in sideways through kitchen windows and everything looks softer than it actually is. Picture a man standing at a kitchen counter, pouring orange juice into 3 small cups. 3 identical cups. Because he has 3 identical daughters. 7 years old. All of them. Born on the same day, in the same room, to the same woman he hasn't seen in 11 years. And on this particular morning, while the juice is pouring and the radio is playing something quiet in the background, one of his daughters, the middle one, the quietest one, the one who watches everything before she speaks, looks up at him and says, "Dad, do you think Mom ever thinks about us?" He doesn't answer right away. He just stands there. Juice in his hand. Morning light on his face. And for just a second, just 1 second, something passes across his expression that none of them are old enough to understand. Then he smiles. A real smile. And he says, "Every single day, sweetheart. Every single day." That's where this story begins. But it's not where it starts. My name is David Callahan. I spent 12 years in the United States Army. I did things in places that most people will never see on a map. I came home with a body that still works, mostly, and a mind that took a few years to remember how to be quiet without it feeling like a warning. I am not a hero. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. I don't say that to be humble. I say it because the word doesn't mean what people think it means, and this story isn't about a hero. It's about a man. Just a man. Who happened to wear a uniform for a while. And who, for reasons that will become clear, spent most of his life after the service trying very hard to disappear. I got out of the Army in 2013. Honorable discharge. No fanfare. I flew back to the States on a Tuesday, landed at a base in Virginia, signed some paperwork, shook a few hands, and drove to a Denny's because I hadn't eaten real food in 3 days. The waitress asked me if I was military. I said no. I don't know why I said that. Maybe I was already practicing. The first thing you learn when you come home, really come home, not the airport ceremony version, not the welcome back barbecue version, is that nobody is waiting. Not in the way you imagined. The country goes on. It went on while you were gone, and it will go on while you're sitting in that booth eating eggs, and the woman behind the counter doesn't know your name and doesn't need to, and the television in the corner is showing something about celebrity divorces, and the whole world is exactly as loud and ordinary and indifferent as it was before you left. I didn't mind that. I want to be honest, I didn't mind it at all. I minded the other thing. The thing that came later. I settled in a town called Millhaven. It's in Central Oregon. Population just under 12,000. It's the kind of place where people know your face before they know your name, and they form opinions about you before you've opened your mouth. I chose it because it was quiet. Because the nearest large city was 2 hours away. Because I found a small rental house on Maple Street with a porch and a yard and a landlord who didn't ask too many questions. I got a job at a hardware store. I kept to myself. For 2 years, I kept to myself very, very well. And then I met her. Her name was Sarah Donovan. She worked at the elementary school downtown, not as a teacher. As a librarian. She had dark hair that she kept in a braid, and she wore glasses that were always slightly crooked, and she had this way of laughing where she'd cover her mouth first, like she was trying to stop it and couldn't. She was 31. I was 32. We met at a grocery store, which is not a romantic setting, but it's an honest one. She was reaching for something on a high shelf. I reached it for her. She said thank you. I said you're welcome. And then she said, you look like someone who's very good at reaching things, and I laughed, actually laughed, out loud, in a grocery store, and that was it. That was the whole thing. That was the crack in the wall. We were together for 8 months. 8 months isn't a long time by most people's reckoning, but when you've spent years building a life that's deliberately small, 8 months of someone else in that life feels like an ocean. She was the first person since I got out who made me feel like I was allowed to take up space. She never pushed me about the army. She never asked for details. She saw me. The real version. The quiet version. And she stayed anyway. I didn't tell her everything. I want to be clear about that too. There were things in my past. Things I did, things that happened to me, things I watched happen, that I had locked away in a place I didn't open. Not because I was ashamed. Because some doors, once you close them for a reason. And I had a reason. Sarah got pregnant. All 3 of them, at once. A surprise that turned into a bigger surprise. We weren't married. We talked about it. We didn't rush it. We had time, we thought. We had all the time in the world. We didn't. Sarah was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder at 22 weeks. The doctors were cautious at first, then less cautious, then very direct. The pregnancy was viable. The babies were healthy. But Sarah's body was not going to survive the delivery. Not with the way things were progressing. They gave her options. None of them were good. She chose the one that saved the girls. She made that choice on a Wednesday. I was sitting next to her. She was calm. That was the thing about Sarah, she was always calm. Even at the end. Especially at the end. She held my hand and she said, "David, you're going to be the best father. You already are." And then she looked at me with those crooked glasses and she said something else. Something I've carried with me every single day since. She said, "Promise me you won't disappear." I promised. The girls were born on a Friday. March 14th. All healthy. All loud. All perfect. Sarah held each of them for about 20 minutes before she couldn't hold them anymore. She held the oldest one first, we named her Emily. Then the middle one, Catherine. Then the youngest, Rose. She held each of them and she whispered something to each of them, something I wasn't close enough to hear. I've thought about that a lot over the years. What she said to them. Whether it was the same thing or something different. Whether it mattered. Sarah died 4 hours later. Quietly. In a hospital room in Portland. I was holding her hand. The girls were in the nursery down the hall, and the world was carrying on, and I was sitting in a white room watching the monitors slow down, and I was thinking about the promise I made. The one about not disappearing. I didn't disappear. I want you to understand that. I did exactly what I said I would do. I went home. I took care of those girls. I fed them and I bathed them and I held them when they cried and I learned, slowly, painfully, messily, how to be a father to 3 babies at the same time. I had help. My neighbor, a woman named Linda, who was 64 and had raised 5 children of her own, came over almost every day for the first year. A social worker checked in weekly. I figured it out. Fathers do. But here is the thing that the story is really about. The thing that I've been circling around. The thing that took years to become a problem. I didn't tell anyone in Millhaven that I was a veteran. Not because I was hiding it. Not exactly. It was more that, when you're a new father, alone, grieving, trying to build something from scratch, the last thing you want is for people to look at you differently. And in Millhaven, people look at veterans differently. Some of them admiringly. Some of them with pity. And some of them, more than you'd think, with something close to suspicion. Like the uniform is a costume you're wearing. To get sympathy. Like the service is a card you're playing. I'd seen it before. In other towns. Other situations. The way a man in a veteran's clinic waiting room gets treated differently from a man in a regular doctor's office. The way people's faces change when you mention deployment. The way conversations shift. So I made a decision. A quiet one. An easy one, even. I just didn't mention it. When people asked what I did before the hardware store, I said I worked construction. It wasn't entirely a lie. I did, sometimes, in between other things. And nobody questioned it. For years, nobody questioned it. The girls grew up. They started school. They made friends. They became people, real, distinct, fully formed people, even though they looked identical. Emily was the bold one. Rose was the wild one. And Catherine was the one who watched. The one who noticed things. The one who, at age 4, looked at me one morning and said, with a seriousness that stopped me cold, "Dad, you have a sad place inside you. But it's not bad sad. It's quiet sad." I didn't know what to say to that. So I just nodded. And she nodded back. And that was enough. I kept the tattoo covered. Always. It's on my left forearm, inner arm, running from just below the elbow almost to the wrist. It's not decorative. It's not artistic. It's a series of numbers and letters and a small emblem that means something specific to people who know what it means, and nothing at all to people who don't. It's a unit designation, a date, and a name. One name. Just one. I got it done in 2012, before I came home, at a shop near the base. The artist didn't ask what it meant. I didn't tell him. In the summer, I wore long sleeves. In the winter, obviously, nobody questioned it. I rolled my sleeves up sometimes, at the hardware store, when I was working in the yard, but I was careful. Always careful. I wore a watch with a wide band on that wrist, too, which covered part of it. It was a habit. A practiced one. Like breathing, after a while. You stop noticing you're doing it. The girls didn't know about the tattoo for a long time. And when they did notice it, Catherine noticed first, because Catherine notices everything. I told her it was from a long time ago, from before she was born, and that it wasn't important. She accepted that. For a while. Now. Let me tell you about the Hartwell family. The Hartwells moved to Millhaven in the spring of last year. February, actually. Early spring, still cold. Gregory Hartwell, Greg, everyone called him, was a contractor. His wife, Diane, worked in insurance. They had 2 boys, both in middle school, and they were exactly the kind of family that Millhaven produces and celebrates, loud, social, generous in the way that people who are also slightly competitive tend to be generous. Greg was the kind of man who volunteered for everything. Who knew everyone's name. Who showed up at every school event with a camera and a wide smile and an opinion about everything from the weather to the school board to the quality of the coffee at the parent-teacher nights. I mention the Hartwells because they are central to what happens next. And because of something Greg Hartwell said to me at a school fundraiser in October of last year, a comment that, by itself, meant almost nothing. But that landed somewhere in me the way a small stone lands in still water. It made ripples. The fundraiser was at the Millhaven Community Center. A big room with folding tables and streamers and a raffle table and about 200 parents milling around with plastic cups of wine. The girls were there, they were in the school's autumn concert earlier that evening, and now they were running around with their friends while the adults ate appetizers and talked about nothing important. I was standing near the back, near the coffee, because that's where I always stand. Near the exit. Near the quiet. Greg Hartwell came over. He was already a little drunk, not sloppy drunk, just loosened up, the way men get when they've had 2 glasses of cheap red wine at a public event. He stood next to me and looked out at the crowd and said, "You know, David, I've been meaning to ask you something." I said sure. He said, "What did you do before you moved here?" Like, professionally. I mean, I know you work at the hardware store, but before that. I said construction. The same thing I always said. He nodded. And then he said something that I don't think he meant to be cruel. I don't think he was trying to hurt me. But he said it, and it stayed. He said, "Yeah, that makes sense. You've got that look, you know? Like a guy who's just good with his hands. Practical. Not a big thinker type." He laughed when he said it. A friendly laugh. The kind of laugh that's supposed to make you feel included. I smiled. I said thanks. And he walked away. Not a big thinker type. I stood there for a while after he left. Holding my coffee. Watching the crowd. And something in me, something I'd kept very quiet for a very long time, stirred. Not with anger. With something quieter than anger. Something closer to exhaustion. The exhaustion of being seen as less than what you are, over and over, by people who never bothered to look. I want to pause here and tell you something about the way this kind of thing works. It's not one moment. It's not one insult or one comment that breaks you. It's the accumulation. It's the weight of years of small things. Greg's comment was just one of them. But there were others. The woman at the grocery store who, when I mentioned I was a single dad, said, "Oh, that's sweet, but aren't you a little old for that?" She was 45. I was 40. The man at the school board meeting who, when I tried to speak during the public comment period, talked over me like I wasn't there. The coworker at the hardware store. A younger man, 26, confident in the way that young men who haven't been tested are confident, who once said, in a casual conversation, "I don't know, man, I just think some people are built for certain things and other people aren't. Like, you're a hardware store guy. That's cool. That's what you do. Not everyone's meant to do the big stuff." The big stuff. I didn't argue with any of them. I never do. Not because I'm afraid. Not because I don't have the words. Because I learned a long time ago, in places these people will never see. That silence is not weakness. Silence is a choice. And sometimes it's the strongest choice you can make. But I want you to understand what it costs. The silence. It costs something. Every single time. Now. The event. The one that changes everything. I need to set it up carefully, because the way it unfolds matters. The order of things matters. The details matter. It was a Saturday in late January. This year. The girls' school, Millhaven Elementary, was hosting its annual winter gathering. It's a big deal in town. Families come. There are activities for the kids, crafts, games, a small carnival set up in the gymnasium. There's a potluck dinner. There's music. And there's a ceremony, a small one, not the main event, but a tradition, where the school honors local families who have contributed to the community in some way. Volunteers, donors, that kind of thing. I hadn't planned to go. I mean, I planned to take the girls, obviously. But I planned to drop them off, stay in the back, eat something, and leave. That was my plan. That's always my plan. But Catherine had been talking about this event for weeks. She'd been working on something in art class. A project. She wouldn't tell me what it was. She said it was a surprise. She said I had to come see it, and I had to stay, and I had to watch her present it. She said, "Please, Dad, please stay this time." So I stayed. The gymnasium was packed. Folding chairs arranged in rows facing a small stage. The potluck tables along one wall. Kids running between the chairs with plates of food. Parents talking in clusters. The noise level was high, the kind of noise that used to make me uncomfortable, years ago, but that I'd learned to breathe through. I found a seat near the back. Middle row, off to the side. Emily and Rose were off somewhere with their friends. Catherine was backstage with her class, preparing for her presentation. I sat down. I got a cup of coffee from the table nearby. I watched the room fill up. Greg and Diane Hartwell were there, of course, Greg in a fleece jacket, holding a plate of something, talking to the principal. Linda, my neighbor, was there too, sitting a few rows up, knitting something in her lap because she always knits when she's in public. Other families I recognized. Other faces I knew by sight but not by name. And then, this is important, a family I didn't recognize sat down next to me. A woman. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Alone. No wedding ring. She had a quiet quality about her, not shy, exactly, but contained. Like someone who was used to being in rooms and not being noticed. She had short gray-brown hair and kind eyes, and she was wearing a simple navy coat over a simple gray sweater. She sat down, looked around, smiled politely at me, and said, "Is this seat taken?" I said no. She said thank you. And then she settled in and looked at the stage and said nothing else. I didn't think much of it. People sit down next to you at events. It happens. About 10 minutes later, the event started. The school principal, a woman named Mrs. Chen, who had a voice like warm honey and who ran that school like a very calm ship, stepped up to the microphone. She welcomed everyone. She thanked people for coming. She talked about the school year. She introduced the activities. And then she said something that made me pay attention. She said, "Before we begin our carnival activities tonight, we have a special segment. As many of you know, we do a short presentation each year where one of our students shares a personal project, something meaningful to them, something that taught them about their community or their family. This year, the student presenting is Catherine Callahan." I straightened up in my chair. Catherine. My Catherine. Middle one. The quiet one. Mrs. Chen smiled and said, "Catherine, whenever you're ready." And Catherine walked out onto that small stage. She was wearing a white t-shirt and jeans and her hair was down, she never wore her hair down, and she was carrying a large poster board in front of her, turned away from the audience so no one could see what was on it. She was nervous. I could see it in the way she held the board, in the slight tremble of her fingers on the cardboard edge. But she walked to the center of the stage, and she stopped, and she looked out at the audience. She found me immediately. Middle of the room. Off to the side. She always finds me. She gave me a small nod, barely perceptible, just the tiniest dip of her chin, and I nodded back. And then she turned the poster board around. I want to tell you what was on that poster board. But I need you to understand something first. Catherine didn't know. Not really. Not all of it. She'd been working on this project for 2 months, a family history presentation, a genealogy assignment that Mrs. Chen had given as an optional extra credit project. Catherine had taken it seriously, the way she takes everything seriously. She had asked me questions. Dozens of them. About my life before Millhaven. About her mother. About where I grew up, where I worked, what I did. And I had answered them. Some of them honestly. Some of them in the way that fathers answer questions when they're trying to protect their children from things they don't yet need to carry. But Catherine had also done her own research. I didn't know this until that night. She had gone online. She had searched. She had found things, pieces of things, fragments of a record that I had spent years keeping quiet. She had asked Linda, my neighbor, questions too. Linda, who knew more about me than I realized. And she had put it together. Partially. Imperfectly. But enough. The poster board had a timeline on it. A family tree at the top. And in the middle, a photograph I hadn't seen in years. A photograph that someone, somewhere, had posted online, and that Catherine had found and printed out. It was from 2011. I was in full dress uniform. I was standing in a room I recognized immediately, a briefing room, somewhere overseas, somewhere I don't want to name. And next to me, shaking my hand, was a man whose face I knew. I felt the blood leave my face. Catherine started talking. She was nervous, her voice was small at first, and she stumbled over some of the words. But she was speaking clearly enough. She said, "This is my dad. His name is David Callahan. And I wanted to tell you about him, because I think most people here don't really know who he is." There was a murmur in the crowd. A few people shifted in their seats. I was very still. Catherine continued. She talked about the timeline she'd made. She talked about my childhood, the parts I'd told her. She talked about my mother, who died when I was 16. She talked about how I joined the army at 18. And then she paused. She looked at the poster board. And she looked back at the audience. And she said, "My dad doesn't like to talk about what he did in the army. He says it wasn't a big deal. But it was." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A printout. She unfolded it carefully and held it up, though it was too small for most people to read. But she read from it. Slowly. In that quiet, careful voice of hers. She read the citation. Not all of it. She'd only found part of it, a fragment from a public military database that someone had posted to a veterans forum years ago. But the part she read was enough. It was more than enough. She read about a firefight. About a convoy. About a medic, that was me. I was a combat medic, who, under sustained enemy fire, crawled across open ground to reach a wounded soldier. Who pulled that soldier to cover. Who applied a tourniquet with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Who then went back. Went back into the open. Twice more. For 2 more men. And who, on the 3rd trip, took a round through the shoulder and kept going anyway. Who kept going because the 3rd man was dying, and because there was no one else. Catherine's voice didn't shake when she read this part. It got quieter. But it didn't shake. The gymnasium was absolutely silent. I was not breathing. I was sitting in my chair, in the back, in the middle, off to the side, and I was not breathing. My hands were on my knees. My jaw was tight. And I was looking at my daughter on that stage, and I was feeling something I hadn't felt in years, something I'd locked away in the same place I locked everything else. Something that was trying very hard to come out. Catherine stopped reading. She folded the paper and put it back in her pocket. And then she said something that wasn't on the poster board. Something she hadn't prepared. Something that just came out of her, the way truth sometimes does, when you're 7 years old and you don't yet know how to dress it up. She said, "My dad has a tattoo on his arm. He hides it. But I've seen it. It has a name on it. And I asked him whose name it was, and he told me it was someone he couldn't save. And I think that's why he's quiet. Not because he's not a big thinker. Because he thinks about things too much. The big things. The things that matter." She looked straight out at the audience. And then, very softly, she said, "He's the bravest person I know. And I think you should know that too." She picked up the poster board. She walked off the stage. And the gymnasium stayed silent. For what felt like a very long time. I need to tell you about what happened in that silence. Because it wasn't empty. It was full. Greg Hartwell was sitting 3 rows ahead of me, to the left. I could see the side of his face. His mouth was slightly open. His hand, which had been holding a plastic cup of something, had stopped moving. He was staring at the stage like someone had just told him the ground under his chair wasn't solid. Diane Hartwell, next to him, had her hand over her mouth. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the way you do when something surprises you and you're not sure what to say. Mrs. Chen was still at the microphone. She wasn't speaking. She was looking at me. Not with pity. With something else. Something like recognition. Linda, 3 rows up, had stopped knitting. She was looking at me too. And she was crying. Silently. The way Linda cries, she doesn't make a sound, she just lets the tears go, like she's decided they have a right to be there. And the woman next to me. The woman I didn't know. The one in the navy coat. I turned to look at her, because something in the air had changed, and I wanted to see her face. She was very still. Very composed. But her eyes were bright. And she was looking at me. Really looking at me, with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not pity. Not admiration. Something deeper. Something older. And then she did something I didn't expect. She reached into her coat pocket, slowly, deliberately, and she pulled out her sleeve. Just the left sleeve. She pushed it up. Just a few inches. And she showed me her forearm. There was a tattoo there. Different from mine. Different design, different placement. But I knew what it was. I knew it the way you know a language you grew up speaking. It was military. It was old. And it was real. I looked at it. I looked at her. And she said, very quietly, so only I could hear, 11 years, Fort Hood. Combat nurse. 2 tours. I nodded. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. She pulled her sleeve back down. She turned back to face the stage. And we sat there together in that silence, 2 strangers who weren't strangers anymore, and we watched the room slowly come back to life. Mrs. Chen was the first one to move. She stepped back up to the microphone. She cleared her throat. And then, and I will never forget this, not for the rest of my life, she said, "Thank you, Catherine. That was extraordinary." And then she paused. And she said, "I think we owe your father a standing ovation." And the room stood up. Not all at once. It happened in waves. Mrs. Chen started it. Then Linda. Then the people around Linda. Then it spread, row by row, like something warm moving through water. And then Greg Hartwell stood up. And Diane. And parents I barely knew. And in about 10 seconds, the whole gymnasium was on its feet, and they were clapping, and some of them were crying, and it was loud, louder than the carnival would be, louder than the music. And I was sitting there, in my chair, in the middle, off to the side, and I wasn't standing. I wasn't standing because I couldn't. My legs wouldn't hold me. Not because I was weak. Because something had broken open in me, something that had been sealed for a very long time, and it was coming out, and I couldn't stop it, and I didn't want to. Catherine came running off the stage. She found me in the crowd. She climbed into my lap. She's 7, she still does that, and she put her arms around my neck, and she said, "Was that okay, Dad? Was that okay?" And I held her. I held her so tight that she laughed and said I was squishing her. And I said, "That was perfect, sweetheart. That was perfect. I need to tell you about what happened after. Because the story isn't over. Not quite. The carnival started. The noise came back. The kids ran around. The potluck food got eaten. People moved through the room the way they always do at these things, in currents and eddies, bumping into each other, talking, laughing. But something had shifted. The air was different. The way people looked at me was different. Greg Hartwell found me near the coffee table about 20 minutes later. He came up to me and he stood there for a second, and his face was doing something complicated, something between embarrassment and something else, something that looked a little like shame but wasn't quite. And he said, "David. I don't know what to say." I said, "You don't have to say anything, Greg." He shook his head. He looked down at his hands. And then he looked up and he said, "I called you a hardware store guy. I said you weren't a big thinker." He paused. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." And I said, and I want you to hear this part carefully, because it matters, I said. Greg, you didn't need to know. That's the whole point. You didn't need to know to treat me like a person. He looked at me for a long time after that. Not with pity. Not with admiration. With something more useful than either of those things. With understanding. Slow, dawning, uncomfortable understanding. He nodded. And he walked away. Linda came to me next. She didn't say anything at all. She just put her hand on my arm, on the left arm, on the outside, above the watch, and she squeezed. And then she said, I always knew, you know. A little bit. The way you hold yourself. The way you look at doorways. I smiled. You never said anything. It wasn't mine to say, she said. And she walked away to find her knitting. The woman in the navy coat found me near the end of the evening. The girls were getting tired. Rose was half asleep on Emily's shoulder, and Emily was trying to carry her, which was funny because they're the same size. Catherine was holding my hand, swinging it back and forth the way she does when she's happy. The woman approached us. She crouched down, slowly, the way adults do when they want to be at eye level with children, and she looked at Catherine and she smiled and she said, You did a wonderful thing tonight. Catherine looked at her seriously. The way Catherine looks at everything. And then Catherine said something that made the woman's face go very still. Catherine said, Hello, ma'am. Do you have kids? The woman said, I do. 3 of them, actually. They're grown now. Catherine tilted her head. Studying. And then she said, My mom had a tattoo too. Dad showed me a picture once. It was on her wrist. Dad said it was a flower. She paused. And then she said, very matter-of-factly, Do you have a flower tattoo? The woman blinked. And then she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and she said, No, sweetheart. Mine isn't a flower. But I like the idea. She stood up. She looked at me. And she said, Your daughter is remarkable. I said, I know. She smiled. And then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a card, a business card, plain white, with just a name and a phone number on it. She handed it to me. Her name was Margaret Holloway. The number, she said, was for her personal phone. She said, in case you ever want to talk to someone who gets it. Without having to explain. I took the card. I thanked her. She nodded once, a military nod, short and clean, and she walked out into the January night. I held that card for a long time afterward. I didn't call her that night, or the next day. But I kept it. In my wallet. In the spot where I kept things that mattered. The drive home was quiet. The girls fell asleep in the back seat, all 3 of them, within minutes of each other, the way they sometimes do, like they're synchronized even in sleep. I drove through Millhaven on the empty streets, past the hardware store where I'd spent years pretending to be smaller than I was, past the school where my daughter had just told 200 people the truth about me, past Linda's house with the porch light on. I drove home. I carried the girls inside, one by one, Emily first, then Rose, then Catherine, who stirred when I lifted her and mumbled something about the poster board. I put them in their beds. I pulled the covers up. I stood in the doorway of their room for a while, watching them sleep. 3 faces. All the same. All different, if you know how to look. And then I went to the kitchen. I sat down at the counter. I took off my watch. I looked at the tattoo for a long time. The numbers. The letters. The date. The name. The name of the soldier I couldn't save, the one I went back for, the 3rd time, the time I took the round. His name was James Whitfield. He was 23. He had a daughter too, back home, who he never got to meet. I think about him every day. Not with guilt. With something else. With the weight of having been there. Of having tried. Of having done everything you can and watched it not be enough. I sat there in the quiet kitchen, and I looked at James Whitfield's name on my arm, and I thought about Catherine on that stage. About what she'd said. About the way the room had been silent, and then the way it had filled with sound. About Greg Hartwell's face. About Margaret Holloway's tattoo. About Sarah, who had held our daughters for 20 minutes each and whispered something I will never know. And I thought about the promise I made. The one about not disappearing. I had kept it. In the most literal sense, I had kept it. I had stayed. I had been present. I had shown up, every single day, for 7 years. But I had also been hiding. Not from the girls. Not from the world, exactly. From myself. From the part of myself that had worn that uniform and done those things and carried that weight. I had put it in a box, and I had put the box in a room, and I had locked the door. And for a long time, that felt like survival. But Catherine had opened the door. Not because she was trying to expose me. Not because she wanted attention or drama or a moment. She did it because she saw something in me that she wanted other people to see too. She did it because she loved me. She did it because she was 7 years old and she believed, simply, completely, without reservation, that the truth about her father was something worth telling. I sat in that kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the January wind moved through the trees on Maple Street, and Millhaven was asleep, and the world was exactly as it always was, loud and ordinary and indifferent, except that somewhere in it, in a small gymnasium with folding chairs and streamers, something had shifted. Something small. Something that wouldn't make the news. Something that would never be a headline or a movie or a moment anyone outside that room would ever know about. But it happened. And it mattered. I rolled my sleeve back down. I put my watch back on. And then I got up, and I went to the sink, and I poured myself a glass of water, and I drank it slowly, standing there in the dark kitchen, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The next morning was a Sunday. I made pancakes. The girls came downstairs in their pajamas, hair wild, eyes still half closed. Emily sat down first. Rose sat on top of Emily, briefly, until Emily pushed her off. Catherine sat down last, carefully, the way she always does, and she looked at the pancakes and she looked at me and she said, "Dad?" I said yeah. She said, "Yesterday, at the school thing. Did I do it right?" I put a plate in front of her. A tall stack. The way she likes them. And I sat down across from her, and I looked at her face, that serious, watching face that had seen more of me than I ever meant to show, and I said, "Catherine. You did it exactly right." She smiled. It was a small smile. The kind that means something landed. And then she picked up her fork and started eating, and Emily started arguing with Rose about something that didn't matter, and the morning light came in through the kitchen window the way it always does, sideways and soft and golden, and I sat there, in my kitchen, in my house, in my small town in Oregon, and I was a man. Just a man. With a tattoo on his arm and a scar on his shoulder and 3 daughters who looked like their mother and a life that was quieter than most people's and richer than almost anyone's. And I was not disappearing. I want to leave you with one last thing. Something I've thought about a lot since that night. Something that doesn't have a neat conclusion, because life rarely does. People will always underestimate you. If you let them. They'll look at you and they'll see what's on the surface, the hardware store, the quiet demeanor, the way you stand in the back of the room. And they'll build a story about you from that. A small story. A simple story. A story that fits the space they've decided you occupy. And you can let them. You can stay quiet. You can keep the sleeve down. You can carry it alone, the way I did, for years. There's a kind of strength in that. A real kind. The kind that doesn't need to be seen. But there's another kind of strength too. The kind that lets someone see you. The kind that trusts another person, even a small person, even a 7-year-old with a poster board and a printout from the internet, to hold the truth about you, and to decide what to do with it. Sarah asked me not to disappear. I kept that promise. But it took Catherine to show me what keeping it really meant. It didn't mean staying. It didn't mean showing up. It meant being visible. Being known. Being seen, not as a hero, not as a symbol, not as a cautionary tale, but as a person. A full, complicated, quiet, real person. That's all any of us want, isn't it? To be seen. To be known. To have someone, somewhere, stand up in a room full of strangers and say, "This is who he is." And have it be true. Catherine did that for me. On a Saturday in January, in a gymnasium in a small town in Oregon, a 7-year-old girl with her mother's serious eyes and her father's quiet heart stood up in front of 200 people and told them who her father was. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't want to hide. I didn't want to hide at all.